We here on the continent haven't had a change of heart. Our hearts are still open to you. Thank you.
I stand corrected. David Davis with those words, corrected by Donald Tusk himself, no less. I've been corrected by worse people, let's put it that way. Let's bring in for analysis by satellite from London, Nina Schick, Director of Data and Polling at Rasmussen Global. Thank you very much for joining us, Nina. Can I just throw this one at you straight away? Do you feel there is the mood for another referendum in the UK?
I certainly don't think that is the most realistic political outcome. Of course, you hear a lot of white noise around the Brexit debate. And of course, you have a hugely large population, a huge segment of the population in the UK who's very unhappy about Brexit. And increasingly, as the Brexit process goes on and it proves to be quite difficult, they think that perhaps they can overturn the Brexit referendum. But that is not the reality, because unless there is a second referendum, that won't be happening. So there's been a lot of debate about how MPs are perhaps trying to scupper Brexit through the work in Parliament, as the withdrawal bill goes through the Houses of Commons. But of course, that is not going to happen. The government has already ruled it out. And I just don't see, unless something really dramatic happens where you have a huge shift in public opinion, let's say perhaps the economy starts to get hit very, very badly, I don't think that's the base case the government here is operating on, and I don't think that's the base case that the EU is operating on either, despite Mr. Tusk's words today. Indeed,
46% to 43% doesn't represent anything like a seismic shift that we would need to force another referendum and perhaps change direction on Brexit. But in terms of hard versus soft, that's probably where the discussion lies, isn't it?
Well, I think the government's policy is already hard Brexit, as Theresa May kind of laid out in her first speech on Brexit, in her Lancaster House speech at the beginning of last year. She said that the UK will be leaving the customs union and the single market. So everything else that comes from that stems from that is the possible conclusion over the UK will end up vis-a-vis the EU, is a hard Brexit, at least in terms of market access. However, perhaps depending on political movements here in the UK, there is some talk of MPs trying to orchestrate a deal where the UK indeed stays in the customs union or in the single market. But then that really begs the question as to why would the UK have Brexited in the first place? Because if the UK is in the customs union or the single market, it will continue to have to accept free movement of people. It will continue to have to make significant budget contributions to the EU, and it will continue to have to accept the jurisdiction of the ECJ. Now, all of those issues were red line for the Conservative Party, and particularly when it comes to the issue of immigration and free movement, that was a huge force that led to the Brexit vote itself. So the government is in a difficult position were it to end up there, because then I think you would see a lot of public dissatisfaction and discontentment in the UK amongst the part of the population that voted for Brexit.
Indeed, a number of those people are now asking themselves why they voted for Brexit when indeed they didn't quite know what it entailed, and some of the things they were led to believe weren't exactly true. Can I put a business question to you? Business people in many areas feeling a bit wobbly about Brexit too, aren't they?
Well, from the view of business, of course, cutting or diminishing access to your largest market and indeed the world's largest free trading area never seemed like a good idea. So I can say with a large amount of confidence that for the majority of business, Brexit was never going to be a good deal. It was all about damage control. And if you look at what's happened in the past few months, that's indeed what has happened with the business pressure on Number 10 to basically, after they wrapped up the first part of the talks on the divorce, they wanted the UK to put forward a transition period, which now is being sold as an implementation period. But in essence, the realization is that even when the UK leaves in March 2019, it's not going to be enough time for the final deal to be ready. So business wants to have at least a two-year transition period where everything essentially stays the same. The only difference is that the UK is no longer on the EU institutions and has no more say on how the rules are made. And that's to give them continuity. That's to avoid the so-called cliff edge. But after those 2 years are up, we still might not be in the final destination because these negotiations are going to take a very, very long time. And that's when, again, you might see some kind of cliff edge scenario, which business wants to avoid under all circumstances.
OK, let's leave Brexit there and look beyond to the other partnerships that Britain's, we're told, could be made with other countries like the United States or going further beyond. Even talk at one stage of the old empire countries or the Commonwealth countries becoming increasingly important. Of course, trade never stopped with those countries, did it?
Well, it's of course much easier said than done because, first of all, under the auspices of the EU, the UK enjoyed a lot of preferential trading agreements with many other countries in the world, for example, South Korea. Now, the question is, do they get to transpose all of those preferential trade agreements as they stand with the EU? And the reality is a lot of the other countries want to see where the UK ends up vis-a-vis the EU first, and then maybe it will talk about where its future trade is going to be with the UK. There's a second question about striking new trade deals with countries like New Zealand and the United States. But of course, as we've seen, it's a difficult process. Striking free trade agreements takes many, many years. So for the UK, having given the competence of striking free trade deals to the EU for the past 40 years, it's going to be a mammoth task. And again, if you believe in the economic theory of gravity, that is that the UK's trade with the EU, no matter, even if it's diminishing over time, it's still far more important than all the rest of the trade that it might open up in other parts of the world. And that's not even coming to different issues such as what the UK is able to sell, whether it's mostly services, financial services, legal services. Are those services that are interesting to other parts of the world like India, Brazil, Russia? And finally, let's not forget that for a lot of these countries, in order to have a free trade deal with the UK, what they will insist upon, and we've already seen this in kind of exploratory talks with India, they will insist upon visa liberalization. And that, again, is a very contentious issue in the UK because immigration, of course, was one of the main reasons that the Brexit referendum campaign won.
Indeed. That was one of the big topics that everybody in every pub and every bar and every cafe in the UK was talking about, the number of migrants, immigrants coming to the country. Some would say they're filling a jobs gap. Some would say they're taking jobs. Depends which to divide you're on, I suppose. But in terms of the United States, because you brought this up, Nina, the special relationship between the UK and the US, it's never looked so precarious, really, has it?
Well, yes. I mean, if you look at what's happened since 2016, is that the kind of two basic pillars of British foreign policy kind of almost went up in smoke at the same time. One was its relationship with the EU, in which its interests, economic, security, geopolitical, were actually guarded by being in the European Union. And the other was with the United States. Now, with the advent of Donald Trump and his own unique America First protectionism, that does not bode well for the kind of free market, open, liberal kind of agreement that Brexiteers or liberal Brexiteers are saying that they want to strike with the United States. There's also questions about even if this FTA between the UK and the US were to be able to be done, would that be good enough for the UK to make up for what it will lose via access to the EU? There's another question about what type of form is the UK going to take? Is it going to be close in terms of regulatory convergence with the EU, which would mean that it won't be able to strike the FTA with the United States? Or does it want to go down more a kind of United States model where its trade with the EU would be restricted, and it can't have both? It was very interesting that Wilbur Ross, the Secretary for Commerce for the United States, came over here to London last year and actually made that point. So in all scenarios, the British government certainly has its work cut out.
Neither Schick, we could go on a lot longer. And some might say we should, because this is a really important issue. But thank you very much for joining us. Neither Schick, Director of Data and Polling at Rasmussen Global. Thank you very much for your analysis on everything regarding Brexit. Two debates happening, one of the Commons, one in the House of Lords. In the London Parliament, we'll bring you developments on that as they happen. We're expecting some news